single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantel Destra. After months of negotiation and 15 deadline extenders, New York State finally has a state budget. The total budget, which works out to about $268 billion, is rich with controversial policy items. State lawmakers spent the week debating the many items that stalled the negotiations at some point, including automotive support, rollbacks to the state's 2019 climate law, funding the state's pension program, along with investments to local government. To understand the specifics on the state budget, now that we have the details, we are joined in the studio with Rebecca Lewis of City and State New York. It's been quite the busy week at the state capitol, with lawmakers voting to enact the state budget this week. So before we get into the specific policy items, I wanted to get your perspective on your big takeaways from the budget process this year and the voting that occurred this week.
You know, this was definitely a more unusual budget process that we've seen for at least even this current governor's tenure and even the previous governor's tenure. And, you know, usually you get the bills all printed around the same time and there's sort of marathon voting. The fact that this voting even had a break between last week and this week, bills were printing much more slowly, plus the fact that this is the latest budget that the governor has had since she has become governor, 2 months late, almost June, but not quite. There are a lot of policy wins in this for both her and for any number of legislators, but it's hard to look at the big picture and not have a takeaway of, wow, this was quite different. This was really late, and even 3 weeks after when the governor herself said that there was a general agreement, right, a handshake deal, it took another 3 weeks before the voting actually concluded, and we saw all of the language that went into that final product.
Yeah, and as you underscored, this budget was rich with policy items, one of those policy items being automotive insurance for New Yorkers. The governor sort of made this a focal point, something that she wanted to focus on, certainly through her executive budget proposal and even back in her State of the State address. This was a very controversial policy items with strong perspectives on both sides, both supporting the governor's proposal, but also, you know, criticizing it. So I wanted to get your perspective on the debate on the floor as it relates to this policy, and why was it so controversial from your perspective?
Yeah, it was quite interesting. This was one of the items, there were any number of things that the governor added in sort of after the fact, later in the negotiations, but this was from the very beginning, and I think a lot of people didn't expect auto insurance reform to be such a hot button issue. You know, who doesn't want to save money on insurance? I think that was sort of the mindset, but the how you go about that was the big question. And you had two very powerful factions sort of lobbying on both sides. On one side, you had Uber pouring millions of dollars into getting their version of reforms passed, which pretty closely aligned with what the governor had proposed. On the other side, you had trial lawyers who, you know, this year couldn't necessarily outspend Uber, but have deep ties, deep connections to the legislature and Democrats in the legislature. So there's a large amount of influence there to get their version of reforms passed that also had support among the lawmakers. So I think that there was a general agreement among everyone, yes, we would love to lower car insurance rates for New Yorkers, but how you do that, you know, what level of it is due to fraud, how do you balance lower costs with higher protections for crash victims, that ultimately I think became the big debate. And in the end, legislators got some of the things that they had originally injected into the conversations, like additional protections against increasing premiums based off of non-driving record factors like zip code and education level, while the governor got one of her priorities, like several of her priorities, not all of them, but for example, changing the definition of serious injury to reduce what she would consider potentially fraudulent payouts or overblown payouts because of billboard lawyers playing up injuries that perhaps are not actually eligible for these much higher dollar payouts.
Yeah. Certainly so much to unpack there. And another policy item that was addressed through the budget process was the state's approach to the 2019 climate law. There was a lot of speculation as how this would come to fruition in the final budget language. But what we saw was the state essentially moving the deadline back several years, but also changing the method that would be used to measure these gas emissions, among other things. So what did you make of this final outcome, given the controversy and criticism about this, policy?
It was really interesting. As opposed to the auto insurance, this was something that was not in the governor's original executive budget. This wasn't in her amendments to her original budget. This was added in much later in the game, technically through an op-ed is when she actually made a proposal, although many people expected something like this to be part of the budget, and it was just sort of a waiting game. It is a little surprising, in my opinion, that the governor really did get almost everything she wanted. It was sort of twofold. The main thing, watching what she had proposed, in my opinion, was moving back the deadline for regulations to enact something like a cap and invest program, probably a cap and invest program, but not necessarily that, to meet the climate goals, because her administration is facing a lawsuit. A lower court judge already ruled that her administration violated the law by not hitting the original 2024 deadline to enact those regulations. So changing that deadline to a future date, ultimately the end of 2028 was what they agreed to, frees her administration of that lawsuit, gives them more time, and not dealing with these legal issues. I was a little surprised to see that the emissions accounting methods, also the changes to those, also made it in, because a lot of environmental activists and lawmakers, of course, were not happy about moving back the deadline for the regulations, but they were even angrier about the emissions reporting standards, because the change, which the governor has defended as making New York aligned with the vast majority of other states, other countries, and how they measure emissions, it is a slightly less stringent, older method that will make the state appear to be closer to its climate goals without actually taking any other additional measures.
I want to get into the strategy. As you mentioned, the governor did get a lot of things that she wanted in this budget, and it's clear that she's not afraid of late budgets, So do you think that this is resonating with New Yorkers? Do you think that New Yorkers are aware of, the importance of having an on-time budget during a year that she is up for re-election? How is this impacting that?
I think that there is a calculation to be had between having a budget that gives you victories to campaign on and having a budget that does not exemplify old school Albany dysfunction. In 2010, when former Governor Andrew Cuomo won his election, he did run on-time budgets, but those budgets that were happening immediately before his election, it went all the way to August. We're not quite there yet, but the budgets in New York used to go incredibly late into the summer, past the scheduled session, and the Albany dysfunction was something top of mind for voters. Granted, this was a different time period. It was also Republicans were in control of the state Senate. We had somewhat recently had a Republican governor. There was a little bit less, quote unquote, one party rule in the state. But I think that for now, the governor did get the budget done ultimately before lawmakers went home for the year. But it is a slippery slope. Every year that she's been in office, the budget has gotten later. And if the trend continues, then it might signal a return to this dysfunction in which that might outweigh, the negatives of that might outweigh the benefits of what she wins.
Yeah. And now that the budget is wrapped up, almost, in June. We have about a week left in the legislative session, and there's so much policy that lawmakers are hoping to get over the finish line before they head home for the summer. So what are some of those big policy initiatives that you're keeping an eye out for in the next week or so?
Well, I think that most of us in the Capitol are waiting to see what they introduce in terms of redistricting amendments, which, we all knew that this was something they wanted to address. Leaders from both chambers were adamant that no matter how long the budget took, there would definitely be time to do these redistricting constitutional amendments. So, first waiting to see how those are introduced, and then they're planning to have two amendments that they're going to pass, one kind of going further than the other in terms of how much they could change the district lines. Either way, I think that those two bills alone will take up at least a day's worth of legislating when they have, including Friday, 5 days. Next week, they have 4 days.
Yeah.
So that alone is going to take up a fair amount of debate time on the floor. I'm personally also paying attention to the packaging reduction legislation called PREA, also called the EPR bill. It's a kind of perennial end of session issue where it seems like it's come very, very close to passing, but it's very controversial. It's the subject of extensive lobbying.
Sure.
And last year, for example, there was talk that it had votes to pass in the lower chamber after passing in this upper chamber, but they ran out of time. So with even less time now to discuss and debate, it remains to be seen if that ultimately comes up, especially, as you said, every single legislator has any number of bills that they want to prioritize before going home.
Yeah, well, certainly a lot to look forward to in the final days of session. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today, but we thank you so much for your incredible reporting, Rebecca.
Thanks again for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
And we were speaking with Rebecca Lewis of City and State New York. As lawmakers have wrapped up the state budget, the focus now shifts to getting outstanding policy items addressed before they head home for summer in about 1 week. One bill that lawmakers and mental health advocates have been pushing is Daniel's Law. If enacted, the bill would establish a process for mental health professionals to respond to certain sensitive matters instead of local law enforcement. Our Elise Klein has more on the bill and the push to get it passed in this next story. And please be advised the upcoming footage is graphic in nature. Let's take a look.
Following the death of Daniel Prude in 2020, New York State lawmakers drafted legislation aiming to improve emergency response to individuals suffering from mental health episodes. Lawmakers drafted the bill to establish a statewide emergency response council in 2022. Nearly 4 years later, it remains stalled in committees in the legislature from year to year. State Senator Salma Baruch, a Democrat representing Rochester and a lead sponsor of the bill, says there are still some remaining concerns from legislators, and she wants to take her time working through the bill.
I think with anything that's new and transformational like this, you don't want to rush through it, right? You want to make sure that you're very deliberate and thoughtful. You want to make sure that you are able to educate not just legislators, but the public around what this law means.
However, state lawmakers and advocates continue to push for the bill despite its slow progress. Brooks says lawmakers have a lot more work to do, stressing the bill is important to prevent further harm.
We know that there continue to be incidents of individuals not having the right people show up when they have a mental health or substance use crisis. And unfortunately, some of them in the worst cases have lost their lives, but in other cases that are just as tragic, just simply aren't getting the care they need, right, or are getting hurt in that process.
She says the bill is slow to make progress, but she hopes it can get to the floor soon.
Our goal is always to have Daniel's Law be the law of New York State and to ensure that no matter what zip code you're in New York State, there is a reliable mental health crisis response and that it adheres to certain guidelines.
The guidelines in the bill would require the use of non-police, community-run crisis first responders, such as emergency medical technicians, 988 personnel, community agencies, peers, and more to help respond to mental health instances across the state. Currently in the state, responses to a mental health crisis often means law enforcement. In Daniel Prude's case, he died after being physically restrained by law enforcement officers in Rochester while suffering from a mental health episode. Advocates say law enforcement officers are not trained to handle these situations, and they often use excessive force instead of de-escalation tactics.
Well, people in a crisis need to be calmed and supported, not escalated, frightened, and maybe arrested, and worse. We know how to help people, even with the most serious needs now. We send out the right workers, we will engage people, and that's what the key is.
Rosenthal adds this bill, if passed and signed into law, will have a significant impact on individuals in crisis.
It saves some lives. I mean, Daniel Prude was killed, police officer. So many people in New York City were killed by police officers. Again, police officers don't want this job, and in some cases they're very bad at it, and people die. So let's put the right person on the street, and we'll save lives, and we'll get people the help they need.
According to data collected by the New York Lawyers for Public Interest, at least 24 people suffering a mental health crisis have died following emergency responses by New York City police in the last decade. The American Journal of Preventive Medicine echoes similar data, citing that individuals with mental health illnesses are often disproportionately represented in fatal encounters with law enforcement, the data showing between 25 to 50% of cases in the United States. According to a 2024 report by the New York State Technology Enterprise Corporation, or NYSTEC, the mental health workforce shortage challenges are a primary reason more crisis calls are answered by police. The analysis also highlights heavy reliance on police for mental health crisis response poses additional risks for Black and Brown communities. Recent examples in the state include 19-year-old Wynn Rosario, who was shot to death by NYPD officers in 2024 while suffering a mental health episode and while his family members begged police not to shoot.
Get out of the way!
WMHT reached out to the New York City Police Department, but they did not respond in time for comment. In a report released last year on Rosario's death, New York State Attorney General Letitia James' Office of Special Investigation recommended that the legislature pass Daniel's law. Ruth Lowenkron, Disability Justice Director for the New York Lawyers for Public Interest, also stresses this bill will save lives. She says she is confident in Daniel's law ability to do this because data shows how well these programs work in other states. In a 2020 study by the Whiteberg Clinic, data showed the crisis assistance helping out on the streets, or CAHOOTS model in Oregon, 0 deaths and 0 serious injuries since it was established in 1989.
They're very successful. They rarely have to call in police, which Daniel's law allows for in rare circumstances. So, for instance, in CAHOOTS in Oregon, they've only called in the police fewer than 2% of the times in 35 years. So that's a program worth modeling after, and we're not the only ones that think so.
According to the Senate sponsor, Daniel's law is based on evidence-based practices from programs and policies around the country. A 2026 report the New York Lawyers for Public Interest did with the Human Rights Watch shows non-police emergency response model programs similar to Daniel's law in 6 other states, high success rates in de-escalation and mental health crisis, and reduction in unnecessary arrests and hospital transports. Shay Herbert, organizer with the New York Civil Liberties Union, says these programs produce positive results because they put the people first.
People are properly trained, there's peers involved, so it's more of an approach that centers the need of the person who is in crisis.
The bill is currently stalled in committees in both houses. Senator Brooks says she feels the bill has enough support to continue gaining momentum.
One thing I'm really proud of is that we have bipartisan support for Daniel's law. So each time that it's passed through committee, it has been through bipartisan support.
However, Assembly sponsor Harry Bronson, a Democrat representing parts of Rochester, says passing Daniel's law this session looks like an uphill battle.
We're probably not going to be able to get Daniel's law done this year, simply because it's very complex legislation. It does change the way a lot of local governments currently are looking at addressing and responding to someone who is suffering a mental health crisis or a substance use crisis.
Some lawmakers across the aisle say they support the concept of the bill, but they still have some concerns.
The concept of Daniel's law, I think it is certainly something that needs to be considered and further developed, even statewide. The only concern that I may have is there is a push to have these task forces or these crisis response teams appear in lieu of law enforcement.
I do not support the idea of sending a mental health worker in place of law enforcement, because someone who's suffering a mental health crisis is often irrational, violent. While the vast majority of people that suffer from mental health issues are not violent people, when someone is acting out in a public way, we need to make sure that we have law enforcement there first and foremost to keep people safe.
The bill language does not outline a response that would specifically exclude or replace law enforcement. The language requires the Emergency Response Council's plans to include a portion of emergency response to be non-police. The bill language also says that all plans for the crisis response teams would have to be approved by both the Commissioner of the New York State Office of Mental Health and the Commissioner of the New York State Office of Addiction Services and Supports. WMHT reached out to the Police Benevolent Association of New York State, but they declined to comment. Kurt Labuda, president of the New York State Police Investigators Association, said in a statement sent to WMHT, the New York State Police does the best they can in responding to these situations. They receive the highest level of training and are well-versed in de-escalation techniques, highlighting the state police crisis negotiator units. Labuda also said there is always room for improvement, and having mental health teams available when appropriate is worth exploring. And some other law enforcement groups agree. In a statement sent to WMHT from Patrick Phelan, the executive director of the New York State Association of Chiefs of Police, said in his opinion the best model responding to a mental health crisis would include law enforcement and a mental health team. Some Democrats who strongly support the bill say they believe Daniel's Law will save lives and prevent history such as Daniel Prude's death from repeating itself.
Daniel Prude rests in peace and in power, and I don't want his name to be ever used in vain. And Daniel's Law is what we are doing as a state to address that, changing how we approach mental health crises, creating systems of support within law enforcement to help that person in their time of need, however that need is.
I think people in a mental health crisis, first and foremost, need mental health professionals and de-escalation. And the fact of the matter is police are not trained in that at all. It's not part of their training. They also don't want to be the ones dealing with that. And we see sometimes needlessly it escalates to lethal force.
While many lawmakers want to see this bill pass as soon as possible, the more immediate goal to get this bill passed is to get Daniel's Law pilot program up and running, according to the bill sponsors. Bronson says information from the pilot programs could make passing Daniel's Law next session more possible.
Yeah, that's the goal, is for these pilots to be feeding information, experience information, data to the state that will then help us better develop Daniel's Law into a piece of legislation we can get passed.
The program was funded in last year's budget, totaling around $6 million, which aims to sustain the pilot program for 3 years. Some advocates say this program will show how this bill will operate in New York specifically.
And we also understand that the bill, is a statewide process, but being able to have these pilot programs in place to really show the effectiveness, I think will help us get the bill across the line.
Lawmakers pushed for $15 million in the Senate One-House budget resolution for Daniel's Law pilot programs. The final state budget this year allocated $8 million for the pilot programs. Some state lawmakers say the pilot program could very well give the bill the push it needs to pass.
It's everything, because you want the bill to pass and it needs the support. So getting the funding there with the bill would give it its support to be enacted, to work as intended to be, and to create, again, the data, the examples that we need, that this is a method, a system that should be adopted.
There are 3 health-led crisis response awardees, part of Daniel's Law pilot programs: Person in Crisis Team in Rochester, Central Nassau Guidance in Suffolk County, and the Children's Home of Jefferson County in Watertown. Currently, the New York State Office of Mental Health is working on executing contracts between the awardees and the state.
What is so exciting, I think, about pilot programs is even if the health-led crisis response pilots are just in these 3 areas, what we're hoping to do is ensure that the lessons learned from those are then generalized to other areas. And I think, again, that's why it was so important that it was rural, urban, suburban.
She says the awardees currently have existing provisions of crisis services and are planning to use the state budget dollars to primarily incorporate peer advocates into their responses and ensure 24/7 health-led crisis response. Kriako says a lot of the work with this pilot program will be ensuring all the systems in the community work together.
One of the very cool things about this pilot program is the huge emphasis on community needs. So each awardee is required to establish a community council that really puts together what is it that health-led crisis response should look like for all individuals in the area that the pilot serves. So that'll be the beginning part of the award implementation. And they also staff up and then make sure that they can get to that 24/7 provision of health-led crisis response.
Kyriakos adds they are looking forward to the pilot programs producing positive results, especially for mobile crisis response services such as 988. Herbert says the pilots will show that this type of crisis response has always been the solution to mental health crises.
What happens when we put people first and people who are trained and equipped and have dedicated their education or just their time to this specific thing? What can happen if we censor compassion in our laws? What can happen if we censor people in our mental health crisis response across the state? And I do believe that with the pilot running and with whatever data comes from, once it's successful and once people are responding to calls and we can pull all of that together, that the state will see that this is just something that works. Daniel's Law just works.
Lawmakers only have one more week of legislative session before they return to their districts. While lawmakers are trying to get this bill over the finish line, the priority does seem to be the pilot program for some lawmakers. They tell me they're hoping this will lead to some progress on additional funding and implementation updates. We'll be following the process of the implementation of the pilot program and additional funds in this year's budget. Elise Klein, New York Now.
Well, that does it for this edition of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,